All right. Last time we had fun. Today will probably be slightly less fun, but possibly, hopefully, just as informative. All right, so we did snakes and ladders over the last couple of days. For those couple of days, we played around, we invented some new rules, and we tried playing them and found that really no matter what you did, it was an improvement over the original because we are not children. But it turned out we could even have some fun with that. And I think the outcome from that is that we've learned that even simple children's games have a wide design pool or a wide design space for changing things up and making it appropriate for a completely different audience. So we did all of this. We already asked this question. So we're going to dive into a little bit more of the why behind a lot of the game design that is out there. So one of the ways we can analyze games is by introducing formal, dramatic, and dynamic elements. This was created by some of the names you might be familiar with from the definitions of games on the first set of slides. Tracy Fullerton and Chris Swain are members of USC. They say that games are made up of three different types of elements. The formal elements are what make the games different from movies, TV shows, other things of the sort. So these involve the rules or the resources, so like the currencies, the dice, as well as the boundaries of the game. Boundaries is an interesting concept because this is usually defined to be something like what separates the game space from the real world. When do you know that you're playing the game versus when do you think that it is something that affects real life? If you've ever played a game to the point where it frustrates you in real life, or you start to get annoyed or angry at another person who is playing the game, you start to blend the boundaries of what is within the space of the game and what is within the space of real life. Or you start playing a game and it becomes more of a second life type of situation where it starts to take over your real life and you start to prioritize the game over the real life. You start to lose control over what's the game and what's reality. As well as when you're playing the game, do you know that you're playing the game? So what is that design space? What is that boundary between the game's world and outside of that game's world? Dramatic elements talk about story, narrative. This includes something like the setting, the premise, where is this game taking place, and all of the information that you need to put yourself into the world of the game. If the rules of the game make sense within the narrative premise of the story, you get immersion. If it doesn't really make sense, then you start to question. It starts to feel more like a game or like a fake setting that you don't take as realistic as if the rules and the premise really do feel like, what do I want to say here, an atmosphere that is cohesive. If that is the case, then it becomes easier for you to become more emotionally invested in winning or losing the game, progressing in the game, because that atmosphere starts to blend with your reality while you're playing the game. Finally, we have dynamic elements. This is what turns the rules into the actual gameplay, what happens as you are playing the game. So the rules are very structured, and how you engage with the game based on those rules allows you to start to engage with the game beyond just, is this legal or illegal? You start to get the dynamic of strategy, of player behavior, relationships between game entities. So we are going to dive into this in a bit more detail. So some formal, let's actually list some of them off. 7 different elements. We can look at player interaction patterns. So if there are multiple players within this game space, how do those players interact? If some of those players are hard-coded as non-player characters, you can, in a player versus environment, you can start to interact with players who aren't real people, but they might be some algorithm that reacts to what you do in some capacity. 1v1, you usually get a very intense competitive environment. Team versus team, broader competitive dynamics. You can have a multilateral where we have a large free-for-all. Maybe there are 16 players, each trying to be the last one standing, 100 players trying to be the last one standing. There's cooperation. If there is cooperation against in a team versus team environment, sure, that's great, but you could also have multiple players working together to defeat an AI or a system. So any of those can be different player interaction patterns, and that really changes how you engage with other people within the game space. We can talk about objectives. What are these players trying to do? When do we know that the game has ended and someone has won? How does progress, what does that look like? If there is no winner and it is just progress, then how can we break down a session of that game into those associated achievements that dictate that progress? In a real-time strategy game, obviously the goal would be to be the last civilization standing, or to achieve some computer-generated goals, like get a unit to this position, and literally anything else within the scope of that genre. But there are always intermediary goals to achieve along the way. Objectives, checkpoints, those can be computer generated, those can be generated yourself of, I need to get my economy up and going. To be able to do this, I need enough workers that mine these kinds of resources, that produce these kinds of buildings. Those are user-generated achievements that would become player-based objectives rather than system-based objectives. So we kind of break this down into those two components, player-based objectives and system-based objectives. We can talk about the rules, just strictly what is and is not allowed. There can be rules that are stated or rules that are coded. So something like a rule is you can't jump off this cliff. Why? It's coded such that you can't jump off this cliff. If you try to, you come up against an invisible wall, or you fall and your character reappears back at the edge of the cliff. Those are rules that aren't stated, but become apparent as you play around with the system, try to jump off the cliff and realize there's an invisible wall there, or something of the sort. So they can be explicitly stated or coded. There are other types of rules that may not be stated like that. There is no rule in Monopoly's rulebook that says you can't rob the bank, but that is mutually understood among all players that that is not something that is allowed, because it would break the immersion of what the game is stating. If we only said rules that aren't stated, or anything that's not stated is a free-for-all, that would make some games pretty interesting. I challenge you the next time you're at a family board game event or something of the sort, have that approach and just say, hey, if it's not a rule, it's something I can do, and see if your family still likes you afterwards. There are procedures. This is what's allowed for a player to be able to do. This could be a combination of rules. The player can use this rule and that rule to allow for a particular action. It could lie outside the realm of all of the rules. So in Snakes and Ladders, rolling a die and moving a piece. In poker, that's an actual procedure that is based on the rules, but bluffing is not particularly stated in the rules of poker, but it is an emerging behavior that comes from the fact that it is not specifically outlawed by the rules, and it is okay culturally for you to do this. That becomes part of the game that's not specifically implied, but it is an emergent behavior that results from that. We have resources, anything that has value in the game. There are all sorts of them, many examples: money, health, items, property in Monopoly, anything that you could collect that has value, could be traded, could be stockpiled, could be spent. We talked about boundaries a little bit. Where does the game end and reality begin? It becomes a little bit more blended if you talk about a virtual reality game where now your senses are part of the game. Overlying the sight of the real world, there is now sight within the virtual reality. So now you're living in two different realities at the same time, one of which is reality, one of which is a game reality. How do you define that boundary, recognize that boundary? Sports, there's the concept of something like good behavior within sports. If you're a team player, if you're a good sport about losing, now you're starting to blend the concept of the boundary of where is the game being played versus outside of the rules of the game, are you making actions that show, I don't like you as a team because I'm playing against you in this sport. So boundaries become very interesting. Finally, we have outcomes. How does the game end? We have the concept of final versus incremental outcomes. A final outcome ends the game. An incremental outcome moves you closer to an outcome. So something like a zero-sum game, if you've heard of that term before, that just means that what one player gains, the other player loses. In chess, if you're playing white and your opponent is playing black, any gains that you make toward winning the game is a necessity that is progress that is lost by the opposing player. Once you reach 100% win probability, by nature, the opposing player has a 0% win probability. D&D, on the other hand, there's no final outcome, but there are incremental outcomes. When you defeat enemies, when you or your party members gain levels, as you gain skills, as you explore new areas that you can go back to, all of those are incremental outcomes that feed forward into the rest of the game. So all of those are formal elements. Dramatic elements, on the other hand, we have premise, character, and story. The premise is just how is the game world structured? If you can think of the opening cutscene of a lot of games, they give you that premise so that when you take control of some character in that world, you have an understanding of where they are, what they're doing. So everything around the rest of the game's story is built on that premise. I find it interesting to think about writing the premise of your favorite game in a single sentence rather than trying to write it as something. So maybe take a second, see if you can come up with a single sentence that describes your favorite game. As you think of it and you want to share, go ahead and raise your hand. See if we can guess what game it is just by the sentence that is the premise. Have that sentence not contain the name of the game in some capacity. Go 1, 2, 3.
Space Ninjas Saving the Universe.
Space Ninjas Saving the Universe.
Warframe.
Yes.
Warframe. All right. Yeah, we'll go 2. What's up? 1, 2, 3.
One-day reunion in the underworld.
I think
Hades.
Yep. Yep. Hades. Excellent.
Angry Man Shoots Demons.
Doom.
Nice. Yeah.
Walking Corpse with a John Wick character.
Anyone think they know?
John Wick plot gives away. It should.
Always okay, so it's Keanu Reeves.
Yes.
Yes. Nice. Good. And then we had who was next? I think I said someone who was next or not. Yeah. So yeah, you went. I saw. Let's go here, then there.
Slaying huge creatures and wearing their skin.
Monster.
Stopping a hungry lizard from eating the world.
I don't think we've heard it so far.
It's Skyrim.
Skyrim.
Oh.
Interesting. Interesting.
I get it. I should. Like, well,
One back here, and then another up here. So 1, 2.
So this isn't a game necessarily, and I didn't create it, but this one always gets like I love this one. It's a young woman arrives in a strange land, kills the first person she meets, then teams up with a cast of unlikely characters to kill again.
Anyone?
Wizard of Oz?
Wizard of Oz, yeah.
That's a good
I
one.
like it. I like it. That's good. Over here?
Shooting the moon, literally.
Yeah, nice. All right, these are good, but you can see that the premise can often be, if a game has a good premise, it can be summarized easily in one sentence that perfectly identifies that game. Which is really interesting to think that these were very different premises. Some of them are more ridiculous, some of them are more mundane or realistic, but they all lead to a game that is interesting. So the premise is very important for that reason. We have character. So who is a part of the game world? Who are you going to meet, team up with? Who are you taking the role of? Are you some observer to what's going on in the game world, but who is of relevance in the game world? So in movies, we have this concept of, all right, the protagonist is going to be someone and go do something and act in a way that you want to root for them. Instead, in games, you often are the protagonist. So your actions, what you decide to do has those consequences. So protagonists can really take a couple of different avenues in this realm. Is it an avatar for the player? Are you supposed to be the protagonist, or are you supposed to take on the role of whomever the designers have made the protagonist and make decisions as them? That creates two really interesting different paths for design that would speak to different players wanting a different kind of outcome from engaging with their protagonist. That becomes very difficult to do. And of course, you have the story, the actual plot of the game, the actual narrative. The premise sets the stage for the story. If the premise and story are disconnected, it's kind of jarring. You have this nice opening cutscene and then you take over and the premise doesn't matter anymore, or something else has happened, or you're doing something completely different. So make sure that there is a link between that premise and the actual plot that unfolds. Dynamic elements, we have this concept of emergence. So in a game, it's not really going to be a game unless there is some kind of unpredictable outcome. What that means is when you start the game, you don't know exactly how the game is going to end, or you don't know what the middle points of that game are going to be, especially if there is some aspect of player choice. So we want to understand what's going to happen based on those game rules. What is it going to look like when players take on the roles of these players, these protagonists, or if it's a board game, if you're taking on the rules with other players around you, what does the strategy look like? What's going to come from these rules? What do those interactions look like? So some snakes and ladders examples. These are with just the basic rules. One player lucks into a bunch of ladders. One player, on the other hand, hits only snakes. The other name that is chutes and ladders. So obviously that should say snakes, but what is the game experience like for both players? If one player lucks into ladders, they're going to feel, wow, this is going really well for me. Maybe they start to feel some remorse for the other player, and I kind of wish I could make this close. Or then the other player says, no matter what I do, there's no agency involved here. I'm always experiencing some negative outcome. So two different players have two different emergent outcomes within the same game. So be aware of how the rules that you create can lead to that different kind of play experience within the rules of those games. Both of these are possible within the rules of snakes and ladders. So rather than fate against player A, what happens if we have player 2 spending every move setting player A back? Now we're going to include some additional rule where maybe you can start to influence where the other player is as a way to get player interaction. if player A is a particular type of game player who, rather than trying to win the game, they just want to make the experience as miserable as possible for everyone else playing the game. I feel like everyone knows someone like that, and they're the worst person to play games with because they spend all of their time just trying to make you as miserable as possible. But the game experience then is there, you get kind of a zero sum. As one player is having fun, the other player is not having fun. And if you incorporate a rule that allows that kind of player interaction, you are inviting that kind of player to engage with the rules in such a way. So as you're designing that, it's really important to keep that in mind. Yeah,
Would you call that, I mean, I know that it's a player-induced action, but like, would you call it a positive or negative punishment? Because essentially they're punishing the other players, which are making other players have a bad experience, which makes them less
Yeah.
likely in the future to play that game again,
yeah,
which is like the difference between a reinforcement versus a punishment. Like,
yeah. You can absolutely use psychological language to dive into the kinds of experience that each player is having in that regard. So you can start to look at that from the scope of your rules. How do your rules lead to particular psychological outcomes? And this is why, as a game designer, it's really important to study at least some psychology, some economics. A lot of different fields come into play when you are trying to create something for other people. You need to understand how those other people are going to experience your game if your game is going to be successful. It's going to maximize the monetization that you want to get out of that game. We talked about narrative, but emergent narrative can be dynamic. So stories that come out of the interactions with the game mechanics. This is not prescribed. It's not strictly coded by the designers. So something like this could be player-driven, a D&D campaign, but it could also be, the example that I like to give for this is I had a roommate in college. This was my first experience playing Saints Row 2, which at the time, phenomenal game. When I played it, it was pretty mundane. I would sit next to my roommate and he had this ability to get into absolutely ridiculous situations. And then the commentary he would provide about the ridiculous situations he was in made watching him play significantly more fun than playing myself, which is interesting that the rules of that game and the freedom allowed by that game allowed for that experience to occur. It may have been the purpose of the developers to create a situation where emergent narrative could happen, but it allows for other players to be entertained. If you can think of this, this is what leads to, in the modern day, if you're going to be a successful streamer, for instance, you want to identify games that have good emergent narratives so that you can create that emergent narrative for your viewers. Of course, as the designer, you don't know what all of these dynamics are going to be. You might think you know, but until you actually sit down and play the game, especially with people who did not design the game, you can start to understand what is the emergent dynamic, what happens when your game is being played, whether that's something that you intended or something that you did not intend as a designer. Questions or thoughts on any of this? All right, we're going to start diving into breaking a game down now into all of it. How do you design for each of these layers? So the elemental tetrad is what came from this discussion, and Jesse Schell in the Art of Game Design book Lenses introduces this idea. So there are 4 different elements that occur at each of the layers that we talked about before, the mechanic layer, the dynamic layer, and the dramatic layer. So all of those can have mechanics. So you can have mechanics designed for each of those. So the actual rules, interactions between player and game. Aesthetics, how is the game perceived by the 5 senses? Technology, everything that goes into the actual making of the game, what technology is needed in order to make the game work. any hardware that you need to run the game, software you need to run the game, any rendering pipelines. If it's a board game, the types and sizes of all of the different physical components, dice, cards, statistics, tables for outcome decisions, probabilities. All of that is the underlying technology. And finally, we have story. It's called story, but really this is all of just Fullerton's dramatic elements. So all the narrative that occurs, and we can see that the tetrad itself goes from more visible to less visible. If you're playing the game, the aesthetics of the game are very visible. They're right in your face. What are your five senses perceiving as you're playing the game? On the other hand, technology, what's actually going on underneath the hood, there are plenty of games for which that is unknown. You can take a guess from a large sample size of players collecting data, but you will never know for sure what those underlying probabilities are. Think about the most complicated game you've played. What is the probability of certain items dropping? You might have some evidence. You might have a very good post on Reddit that gains a lot of traction from a massive sample size, but you don't know for sure unless you're actually looking at the game code, which you don't have access to. So we have a visibility between the aesthetics and the technology. We're going to dive into this tetrad at multiple different layers to try to understand how can we target for each one of these at those different layers. So that is where we are headed. And it becomes a whole chapter. Questions before we dive into this? All right. Everything we've already talked about is going to be kind of combined. The goal of this is just to be able to break a game down into its logical components. So 3 layers, each of which has its own elemental tetrad. We have the inscribed layer. This is what happens when the game is not being played. So what is all of the design of the game that exists outside of the actual play of the game? Anyone think of an example of something like this? Maybe a rule book in a board game? You can read the rules without playing the game. You can understand aspects of how to play the game without actually playing the game. Yeah.
So another example could be in the casinos, the slot machines, they have the payouts and then it shows like what you need to get certain payouts.
Yeah. So you're not actually playing the game, you're thinking about the game or researching the game, or maybe reading a guide that someone else wrote about the game. The game is not live, but you can read someone else's walkthrough. You can, so there's lots of different elements that belong in this inscribed layer. What about your game exists without actually playing the game? Dynamic is the opposite of that, aspects of the game that exist while it's being played. And finally, an interesting one, the cultural layer, beyond even the game itself and the concept of the game, how does the game affect society? There's an entire tetrad for the cultural layer. So we're going to break all of this down and talk about each one of these layers, go through the entire tetrad so that you get a concept of how you could design for each of these elements and what the use is. So we're going to start with the inscribed layer, describe it in detail, and then talk about how each of the elements of the tetrad can be used at the inscribed layer. So we talked about mechanics. So the mechanics is one of the 4 layers of the tetrad. So systems that define how the game is going to interact. The game doesn't need to be running or being played in order to understand the mechanics of the game. So aspects like game rules, player interaction patterns, so player versus environment, player versus player, you can start to get an understanding of the mechanics of the game. All right, before I play, my goal is to be the last one standing. Objectives, same thing. Resources, what are you going to be collecting? Yeah.
Would like videos of people playing the game kind of fit under mechanics? Because it's like you're not playing the game, but you're watching someone else and you're getting like half the gist of the game. How to
Yeah,
play.
it's kind of blurry, but at the same time, if you're I'm imagining in a game, I'm approaching a very difficult boss fight. Rather than going in blind, I would prefer to watch a few other people tackle that boss fight so that I am more likely to be successful through understanding the mechanics without playing the game. Interesting.
I can think of a different example of that.
Yeah.
One of the games I played, Destiny 2, has raids. And every raid has its own mechanics of how to complete the encounter.
Yeah.
And a lot of people make videos on how to do that.
Yeah, so tutorials of some aspect of a game, sure. We talk about how the game appeals to the five senses, but you could be listening to the soundtrack of the game without playing the game. If it's a particularly good soundtrack, maybe you use that to study or use that for some purpose that is not playing the game. You can look at or draw character models without playing the game. Maybe you find a particularly interesting character, you like their outfits, and you want to draw other people in those outfits. Or you can start to see how the game exists beyond just the gameplay. This isn't necessarily cultural because it doesn't deal with culture at large, but it deals with how you could continue to use aspects of this game beyond the gameplay. Character models, maybe some particularly attractive packaging or art. If you've ever looked at maybe a Steam game and thought, this thumbnail of this game looks really interesting, knowing nothing else about the game, now the thumbnail gets you to visit the store page that gets you to buy the game. Those all involve the five senses. They involve you engaging with aspects of the game that aren't really part of the gameplay. Something that developers or artists have that evokes something in your five senses. Any underlying technology that makes the game work. So not anything that is active while it's being played, but the technology that makes the game work. If you write a game using Unity and C#, that is technology that was used to create the game. It was responsible for part of the game that's not necessary. You publish the game from that point, but it's technology that has helped to make the game work. We talk about narrative, so any story, characters, premise, and plot, but only those that are prescripted. Anything that is part of the actual game's code. That exists beyond the play of the game. If I were to ask you to summarize the plot of your favorite game, that doesn't mean that you need to launch the game to figure that out. It's something that you can state because you have played the game. So it's something you can communicate about the game without to someone who hasn't played the game. So we're going to dive into each one of these in a little bit more detail next. Actually, we're going to summarize all three layers, and then we'll dive into the entire script layer. Summary of the dynamic layer. The mechanics are going to be, now we're talking about dynamic. So this is what's happening during the game's play. How do we as players interact with the mechanics of the game that exist outside of that gameplay? Now we're playing the game, so what does it look like to engage with that? Procedures, strategy, emergent game behavior, the outcome of a particular game as it's being played, all of those are dynamic mechanics. Looking at the five senses, as you're playing the game now, what do you feel? What do you see? What can you, strange one is taste. What can you taste while you're playing a game? If you are playing a terrible horror game and you get a sense of imminent doom or that a jump scare is coming, maybe you actually do taste something as you prepare for that jump scare. The technology, what's happening during gameplay, the technology that's being used. So any actual performance of scripted AI that's dynamic based on the exact gameplay that you're using. I like to go back to RTSs for something like this. As you play a particular real-time strategy game, what is the AI doing in that game? The algorithm is part of the inscribed layer, but exactly how they're reacting, how that algorithm reacts to what you are doing in this game is dynamic technology. If there are small sample deviations from expected probabilities, going back to snakes and ladders, you expect to hit ladders and snakes with about equal probability, but it's not guaranteed. You may go through an entire play of that game hitting nothing but ladders. that creates emergent behavior that changes the technology of the game based on what happened in that particular run of the game, that particular instance of the game. So everything the game does after it launches. All of that is dynamic and narrative. I talked about my roommate playing Saints Row, but something like if you have a particular story out of a family that you create in The Sims, if you break an 80-year playoff drought in a particular sports game, those kinds of emergent narratives that rely on the actual game being played to create that narrative, then that is a dynamic narrative. Questions on the tetrad of the dynamic layer? And again, we'll dive into each one of these in a little bit more detail. Finally, we have the cultural layer. So some mechanics. If there are any player-made mods for a game, this modifies the game rules, modifies the game assets, you can change the game, but it was not part of the original game. This is something that the community at large has done to modify the game for some reason or another. I occasionally write things that I probably shouldn't, but
I mean, it was an actual thing you could do
Yes.
that's allowed.
yeah, so this creates or can create something that now is discussed in society. So something like the original hot coffee in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, or something that is now something that was originally put in the game, hidden, players discovered, and then it became more of a cultural, this was put in the game? What were they thinking? Or other players, this was put in the game? Who knows? But you have different reactions throughout society and creates more of a cultural discussion about the mechanics of a game.
Did you call the GTA 31 a zero sum?
Cultural aesthetics, you can start to talk about things like published fan art. You could talk about soundtracks that have been remixed or someone who uses their own instruments to live play something from a game soundtrack. Any memes that become popularized based on something from the game, any cosplay of that you would see at a local game convention. If games appear in other media, maybe someone in a movie is playing a game that is a popularized game. Now it has another cultural representation within society other than just people playing the game. Now it is in other media. Technology, any game technology used for some other purpose. So for instance, auto clickers, or an expansion of the definition of a word game to become more than just a word game. So there are some underlying technology that can be used for some purpose outside of the realm of what the developers intended, but used to play a game. I like to go back to the incremental genre for the use of auto clickers. You can either give yourself carpal tunnel syndrome or you can not. Seems like a pretty easy decision to me. And then, of course, cultural narrative, anything fan-made, any stories told about the game. Maybe someone publishes a story set in a game world that exists in a game, but is now fully fan-made or generated. This can also include ways in which the story affected people in real life. We'll talk about a couple of examples of that later. So, as a quick set of questions for you to think about everything that we've talked about so far. Why do we care about distinguishing these different layers and this different tetrad? Why would it make sense to actually break this apart and start to think about these as individual elements that come together to make the experience? Yeah.
Because like the tetrad shows, they interconnect and affect each other. When
Right.
you change one thing, it changes another aspect of the game. Like entire aesthetics and narrative of the game was affected because how you implemented the inscribed elements and mechanics of the game.
Right, yeah. I find that understanding this at an academic level or starting to think about it like that allows you to take the experiences that you have and add a new dimension to it. I enjoyed this because it was fun. Great, but why? If you want to be able to try to recreate that, you can start to break it down into these elements and say these elements worked really well together. If I'm going to design a game with the goal of invoking the same feeling that I had when I enjoyed this, my goal is to create a similar kind of interaction between these kinds of elements. So being able to think at that level of depth will help you to create games that it's not just based on your own experience. And I think this is going to work because I had fun with it. I see that all the time in papers that I read, and really at the higher level college level, we're looking for more depth, more analytical depth than that, of trying to understand why is it that you like what you like? How can you break that apart and then reconstruct it into something that is new that creates that same level of engagement that you find? How can you design something, a game that someone else will like that you personally do not? That is a huge challenge as a designer. I personally loathe platformers. Don't really have too much fun with them. That said, I would be loath to call myself a good game designer if I could not design a platforming game that someone else who likes platformers would enjoy. How do I do that if I can't draw on my own experience having fun with platformers? I have to be able to break them down and understand those players and how these aspects help those players to enjoy that kind of game so that I can start here to create that experience. You're not only designing games for yourself at this stage, you're designing games for commercial success, which means it needs to appeal to a particular kind of audience, and you can't keep making games only for your own preferences. That will limit you significantly in what you can do and how successful you can be. Another interesting question that kind of dives into the ethics of game making. What are our responsibilities as designers? What effects can we have on people from what we create? And what should we be thinking about as we design games?
Make a fun story that people get engaged with.
Yeah, story in general. Is it possible when you're designing a story to be offensive to people?
Absolutely.
Is that something that you should consider as you are designing a game? Depends. If you're trying to target a very particular slim demographic who is all going to appreciate whatever decisions that you make, maybe that is worth it. But maybe if you're also overly scared of doing that, maybe it seems to, the end result is something that is generic or feels like it's not really saying anything or doing anything. Sometimes you have to take a few risks to be able to make the kinds of points that you want to make narratively in your own game. What else? What are our other responsibilities?
You even take what you said about narrative when it comes to game mechanics. Is this actually innovating any sort of game design or underlying features that have been done? Is this just so bland in an oversaturated market that it's easily looked past as soon as people play it for maybe 5 minutes?
Fair. So as we start to think about what our responsibilities might be, how do we, what triggers do we have in our own minds for thinking, I should probably think about my responsibility as a designer as I am designing this? What would help us to be able to start to think about that?
If you're making a game aimed at kids, don't put a bunch of like microtransactions that they could just go.
Even if it makes you more money, that might lead to some kind of negative view from society on your company for doing something like that.
You're attacking Ubisoft's revenue right now.
Yeah, anytime there is real money involved, it's important to think about how your player base is going to respond to that. Sure. Anything else? Yeah,
I guess like, also like posting disclaimers in the games. like-
disclaimers, yeah,
Like a game that has disclaimer like warning, flashing lights or something like that,
yeah,
and like, I even played gosh, again, I forget what it was now, but in the loading screen, it's like. Make sure you manage your time wisely and your funds wisely and it even like capped you at a point where you couldn't spend money to keep progressing, so that you wouldn't waste your life away.
yeah. Some other things you might want to consider, lawsuits, if you're using any intellectual property. And Pal World.
On that same note, content warnings.
Yeah, content warnings for violence, sex, nudity. Anything else that might be considered to be inappropriate to some audiences might be worth warning. This game contains this. You can now opt in or opt out.
And you can totally away this, right?
Yeah,
Accessibility options.
yeah, accessibility. So something like, am I gonna have some colorblind users?
Or, dyslexia.
Yep, absolutely. So all of these are worth thinking about. We're unfortunately out of time already somehow, but we will come back and continue to discuss and think about how games work. I'll see you tomorrow for that.
That's probably a great idea to throw in all of the responsibilities.